Hi everyone, welcome back to the Harbinger China Tech Podcast. Today we have joined us Alan Jiang, who is the head of Southeast Asia business for Ofo, the world's leading station-free bike-sharing company. He oversees the company's strategy and operation in the Southeast Asia region. Previously, Alan was at Uber for 4 years, helping to launch Uber's business in China, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Indonesia. So today, Alan first starts by sharing a little bit more about his story starting off at Uber before transitioning over to Ofo. He tells us more about how bike sharing is drastically different from ride sharing, and he talks about the impact that companies like Ofo have on the cities themselves that these bikes are located in. Alan also talks a little bit more about Ofo's global strategy and how its Southeast Asia efforts fall into that. So Alan, I understand you're currently the general manager for Ofo in Southeast Asia, but even before joining Ofo, you had quite a bit of a career at Uber, where you helped launch a number of different markets in Southeast Asia before becoming general manager of Indonesia. So actually, why don't we start there? Can you tell us a little bit more about your experience with Uber?
Yeah, thank you, Adam. So Uber was a very exciting journey for me. I joined Uber. I was there for about 4 years, and I started as a operations manager in LA, kind of managing the supply side of the business. Frankly, I thought I was going to live in LA for a while, and I actually had moved there for the opportunity from Boston. But 7 months into the job, Uber started expanding quite rapidly internationally. And one of the countries we were looking to explore was China. So I had an opportunity to go out and help out with a launch there. And from then on, I ended up staying in Asia. So I was in China, and then went down to launch Uber in Malaysia and Vietnam, and then ultimately ended up in Indonesia running that business for about 3 years. At the time, Asia, was very new to me. I'd been to China a couple times with internships in college, but Southeast Asia was completely new. So it was a very interesting adventure to kind of explore all those different countries and cultures, and figuring out how to grow a new business there.
Yeah, thanks for that. And certainly for Uber, it's been quite a tumultuous year. Is there anything you can share, from your perspective on the front lines, as a general manager in Southeast Asia? Anything you can share with us to provide more insight on that?
Actually, it's a very interesting question, because the timing was very interesting. I actually saw most of this, actually almost the entire year, as an outsider, because I left Uber in February. While I was at Uber for 4 years, it was a very exciting journey for me, but I definitely wanted to take a few months off and kind of think about what the next step was. I was planning to take a couple of months off, travel a little bit in the U.S. and catch up with family and friends there, and do a little bit of traveling around Southeast Asia for leisure and not business. So that's what I did.
Right. Okay. And clearly that brought you to Ofo. So tell us a little bit more about your experience there. I mean, quite a bit of overall experience, network that you built in Southeast Asia, and clearly a very capable skill set. How do you apply all of that to Ofo? Was it a straightforward transition? What was going on in your head at the time?
I have to be honest. I wasn't thinking that much about bike sharing at the time. Bike sharing was a concept that I was aware of quite early on, because a lot of Uber people in China had actually joined, Ofo after the Uber and Didi merger. So a lot of my ex-colleagues had been very early on in the bike sharing craze. But frankly, when that happened, I didn't really think it was going to be something that was going to go outside of China. But it was kind of around the, I think, July or August point of time, when the bike sharing opportunity kind of came onto my radar. And so I kind of thought, hey, maybe it's something that's worth exploring. And so I was living in Indonesia at the time. So I actually flew to Singapore, went to try out some of these bike sharing apps, Ofo, Mobike, and Obike. And I was like, wow, this is actually, very, very convenient service, and I could actually see it working in Southeast Asia. So that's kind of when my interest was piqued. Did a little bit more market research, tried to answer that age-old question of, are these companies ever going to make money? Which I think is one that's frequently in the headlines. And I kind of, did the math and realized that actually, it could be a very viable business model. So I became very interested, kind of went through the process, and ended up joining Ofo in October.
Okay, cool. Well, first of all, congratulations on that. Going from Uber to another unicorn company like Ofo. And so, before we get to what you currently do at Ofo, I mean, you're the general manager for Southeast Asia. Last time we caught it, you mentioned that it's certainly an area, strategic area of focus for them in terms of expanding that market. But just for our audience to better understand Ofo, could you actually give us a comparison between what Ofo does versus Uber? Right? Because to my knowledge, it's not as simple as saying for Uber it's cars and for Ofo it's bikes. There are some pretty inherent differences there.
Yeah, sure. So, Uber was a ride-sharing platform where you take out your phone, you push a button, and a car gets summoned and comes to your doorstep and takes you somewhere. I would say, it's a very convenient way of getting around town, and because of the data and technology in the app, we actually were able to bring that cost for consumers down while also providing drivers with higher earnings than they would be able to do driving in an alternative service.
Right.
So really, it was kind of providing that level of price and convenience to consumers, and while also providing for drivers. I would say Ofo is a little bit different, or very different. I think there isn't really a comparable service for Ofo today. I guess the closest comparison would be to ride your own bicycle around. But I think in a lot of countries, biking is very popular. But there's also a lot of countries where biking is not very popular. And I don't think Ofo is going to come into a country and completely, you know, take over everyone's transportation habits, and everyone's just going to be riding around on bikes all day. That's definitely not what's going to happen, and it's not what we're trying to aim for. What we see is bike sharing is a really, really convenient way of getting around the city for short trips, so 0 to 3 kilometers. And what happens is it becomes a very good complement for the city's public transportation infrastructure. So it's a last mile solution for public transit, whether that's buses or MRTs. And citizens of the city also have the option of walking, driving their own car, taking a ride-sharing service, taking taxis. So all of those options are kind of available. And bike sharing is kind of just a piece of that, which really I think is probably the most convenient piece in terms of getting around for sub 3 kilometer trips.
Right.
And really the the convenience lies in the price is probably one of the most competitive ways of getting around the city, except for walking. But then there's also the convenience piece of being able to see a bicycle in basically high density demand areas. So very popular areas are last mile solutions for MRT or bus stops, for example. And instead of having to walk 3 kilometers home, or instead of having to hail a ride sharing app, which will be more expensive and maybe takes 5 to 10 minutes to get there, the bike becomes a viable alternative.
Right. Right. Thanks for that. I think another major difference is that with Uber and with car sharing, ride sharing, uh, it's not just a matter of the vehicle being different, the car versus the bike, but for cars you also have a driver. Can you tell us a little bit more about the implications of having a driver as part of this overall network that you build up versus OFO, where it's just the end user picking up the bike and using it?
I think in terms of the business implications, it's definitely there's a much bigger focus on supply chain at OFO. So that's one of the big challenges. Additional pieces of challenge that we have to work on as compared to ride sharing
Right.
is manufacturing, logistics, and actually and dealing with the hardware. We work a lot. We have a hardware engineering team as well as software engineering team to work on building that product out as good as possible for consumers.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and back to that point, it seems that Uber is extremely valuable company. The concept of ride sharing, because you can build up these network effects on the two-sided market with the drivers on one end, and then the consumers on the other. The more drivers, the more supply, the better experience for the end user. So it certainly becomes more of a winner-takes-all market. For bikes and bike sharing, uh, again, a little bit different. I understand your point about how it's harder, in a sense that you need to manage the entire supply chain. But can you tell us a little bit more about the network effects that have been generated with OFO.
I certainly think that there are benefits to having more bikes on the street. I think one of the biggest value propositions for bike sharing is the convenience of being able to see a bike very nearby, and then just ride it away, and then park it at a designated parking spot, and not having to walk very far in either end of the journey. I think having to, if we have to walk 1 kilometer to simply find a bike, it kind of defeats the point of having the bike sharing service in the first place. So certainly, I think that having more bikes in the city is actually also driving a lot more ridership. If we went to Beijing, for example, and there was only 100 bikes scattered around the whole city, I don't think anybody would use the service because it would just be simply too hard to find bikes.
Right.
So I think it's really finding that sweet spot. Definitely putting in too many bikes and oversupplying the market is definitely not going to be ideal either, and it's kind of a waste of money, I think, for bike sharing companies.
Right.
But I think the same can be said for ride sharing, and if there's too many drivers on the platform, then none of the drivers will make money.
Right.
So I think in both cases there is definitely that sweet spot where adding supply drives more demand up to a certain point, but not beyond.
Okay, cool. And you know, following that point, can you talk to us a little bit more about implications of bikes on the cityscape itself? So, if people think about ride sharing or think about autonomous vehicles, think about, oh, there's a less of a need to have my personal car, and as a result, in the future, maybe that could change, even streets or how cities are designed or maintained. So for bikes, I imagine kind of plays to the overall theme as well. Tell us a little bit more about its impact on cities.
That's a very interesting question, and I think addition of the transportation option of a bicycle in a city can definitely have a huge impact on the way that cities think about building out the transportation infrastructure. Um, I think as cities around the world get more and more populated, everyone is trying to invest in building out more public transit. It's the most space efficient way of moving people around the city. But one of the biggest questions around public transit is how to solve that last mile solution. And I guess pre bike sharing, the last mile was either going to be walking or some form of car transportation. And walking 3 kilometers is not very fun. Um, but if it's but then the alternative is you need to build MRT stations that are very close together, so people don't need to walk that long. Or if they're very far apart, then people end up taking cars for the last mile, and taking and neither of which are very very good options. So the bike sharing option kind of can help a lot with has a lot of potential to kind of help with city planning in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's also very exciting to see cities moving towards bike-friendly city planning. So that's building out bicycle lanes and generally making the city easier to bike. I think right now some cities are definitely ahead of the curve on that, and there's definitely some cities that are only still trying to step into that game. But I think it's very exciting, and we see that opportunity is engaging with cities and providing them with, hey, there is this option of a very viable way to make bicycles easy to use in your city.
Right, right. Yeah, that makes sense. And I was wondering, like, can you layer other services on top of these rides? What I mean is, for example, if you're a Uber driver, you can also deliver food. So Uber Eats, um, and in some companies in the U.S., there's Postmates, for example, or some other courier services where folks are literally biking around the city to deliver products and goods because it's actually more efficient to bike around than to drive around a congested street. Um, in those cases, there's actually I guess a third party on a bikes and helping deliver stuff. But in the case of O4 Mobike or other bike sharing services in China and beyond, it's usually the end user, end consumer who's biking around trying to get from point A to point B. So in that context, are you guys thinking about other types of services to layer on top of the ride itself?
I think at this point of time, we're very just focused on building out that our core business of rolling out bicycles and having it be a convenient way of getting around city for short trips. Um, you know, anecdotally, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of food delivery drivers are currently using bicycles already, since it's probably faster in terms of being able to cut through congestion. It's also cheaper for them in terms of not having to pay for fuel expenses. Um, and I think in general that level of convenience, we have seen a lot of bike trips starting to replace short trips, whether that's for delivery drivers or even for the average consumer in cities.
Right, right.
Um, and to the extent that we actually we did a study with one of the environmental agencies in China, and found that the fuel consumption in China year over year in April actually has declined by 6%.
Wow, yeah, that's really incredible. I imagine typically there's increase year over year, given that there's more people who are consuming and getting around and using energy. So, okay, well, beyond the thought of layering services on top of the rides themselves, the rides themselves actually generate data as well. So, could you tell us a little bit more about how OFO thinks about data and how you're able to leverage it?
Yeah, so we're collecting a lot of data on the way that traffic flows kind of move through the city. So we're and we study that data very carefully in terms of how we actually deploy our bike supply. So we manage our supply on the ground very carefully. So we have a large team of people on the ground who kind of move bikes from low demand areas to high demand areas, collect broken bikes, bring them back to the warehouse for repairs, and so we have to use our data to make sure that our team on the ground is being very efficient about the way they manage that supply. Another thing that we're thinking about that could be very interesting with the data is that we collect a lot of information about the way that traffic flows through the city. And that has a lot of potential usage in terms of the way that a city can plan their infrastructure.
Right. Thanks, Alan. And understood that you guys are creating not just a valuable service for the end user, but with greater implications on cities and the environment around us. So let's get back to your role itself. Actually, I mean, you're clearly the general manager of Southeast Asia. So I'd love to learn a little bit more about how you guys are thinking about global strategy and where Southeast Asia fits in.
Mm-hmm. So 2017 has really been a very exciting year for OFO in terms of how quickly we've been expanding internationally. Um, so we've hit a new milestone in terms of global trip growth, and that's 32 million trips in a single day. So it's a very very large and fast growing business, and we're starting to expand very quickly internationally as well. The main areas today we're in 17 countries. The main ones being in U.S., Europe, and across APAC, especially focusing on Southeast Asia and markets outside of China right now. So in Southeast Asia, we're in, which is the region I'm managing, we're in Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand. And we're very, very excited about this region and seeing the growth numbers that are coming out of it right now. I think one of the big questions that a lot of people ask for Southeast Asia is, hey, I think that there's not a lot of bike sharing or biking culture in the region, and maybe it's something that's very exciting for China, but considering the weather or the traffic, it feels like something that may not work very well in Southeast Asia. Um, I think I think that was definitely a concern that I had as well before joining OFO. But I think after kind of seeing the growth numbers and the way that people are using the service, I'm getting very very excited about the region. And I think at the end of the day, uh, I think biking in Southeast Asia hasn't been popular because it wasn't convenient to do so. But when we start seeing that bikes are easy to kind of access, and the cost of actually biking around the city is very cheap, then I think it becomes a very exciting opportunity. So kind of going back to your question about what we're trying to achieve globally, I think it's really trying to plug in with cities and provide bicycles as a viable alternative for getting around the city. As I said earlier, we're not trying to replace any form of transportation, but really just becoming that option for people in the 0 to 3 kilometer range. And I think that means, figuring out how to provide, like, find out where the high demand areas are, making sure that we always have bikes readily available, and making sure that we can sustainably offer those bike services to people at a very low price.
Right. Got it. Yeah. So the overall global vision and what you guys are trying to achieve makes a lot of sense. What you mentioned about Southeast Asia, it's very good to hear that there's promising growth there. Another question that I figured that our audience would be interested in is that Southeast Asia is not just one country. It's an entire block of multiple countries comprising Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, etc. So how do you think about navigating the different countries and how do you guys approach each of them separately as part of the overall SEA block?
Yeah, I think Southeast Asia is a very unique region in that sense, that there are so many different cultures and languages, and I think that's one of the challenges that a lot of international companies face when kind of tackling this region. And maybe even, one of the mistakes that are made is tackling the region as one block. But really, each country operates very differently in terms of the way people do business. They have varying levels of infrastructure maturity, whether that's transit or banking or telco, and I think a lot of these impact the way that we do business. So I think we need to make sure that we localize very carefully in each country we go into, and that starts with hiring a local team. So every country that we go into, we definitely want to make sure that we have a local team running that business. And that's a local GM, a local ops person, a local marketing person who really understand the nuances of that country. And, they're the ones who are going to be running that business.
Okay, cool. That makes sense, Alan. And last question for you is around, Ofo is obviously one of the biggest bike sharing players out there, whether in China or around the world. Another major one is Mobike, followed by another long tail of other players. So when it comes to the Southeast Asia strategy and what you guys are seeing, how are you guys operating there versus Mobike, and do you have a sense of what they're up to?
I think the thing that we've really, one of the things I really learned at Uber, and one of the things that I think will be a very big factor for us as bike sharing kind of grows across the region, is we want to have a razor focus on the product experience for customers. So really kind of figuring out what it is that customers want, why customers use our product, and being able to provide that to them. So I think for bike sharing, our focus is really going to be on making sure that we can provide the service at a convenient and affordable rate for consumers. And so we'll be, working a lot with data in terms of figuring out where to put bicycles. We'll be having a very large team of people on the ground as an operations team to make sure that bikes are constantly being moved out of low demand areas and into high demand areas so they can be used very efficiently, and working on developing those processes. So I think ultimately that's kind of the feedback loop, and we want to make sure that when people use Ofo, they know that we're the most available, most convenient service that they can use.
Yeah, so thanks for that. But I think the thing is still there's Ofo, Mobike, two of the biggest giants in this area. And when you look at previous examples, whether it's Uber or other type players, usually it's either one 巨头, like one massive leader, where it's more of a winner takes all market, or in some cases there's consolidation. So in China you see this quite often. You got DMP and Meituan, which merged a while back. And then obviously Didi absorbed Uber in China. So what are your views on eventually consolidating with Mobike or some of the other bigger players out there?
I think that bike sharing and ride sharing are very different spaces in this regard. I think that in the ride sharing space, uh, we often saw competitors who were subsidizing more than the cost of a single trip. And when you pay incentives to drivers or riders that can amount to more than the cost of a ride, you basically have a endless like a bottomless pit of where you can throw money into.
Yeah.
I think for bike sharing, it's a very different story. No matter how low the cost of the bike is, like even if it gets to zero, it doesn't cost you money for that individual trip to happen. So I think that in that sense, it's very different from the competition that happened in ride sharing. And at this time, I think OFO, we see a lot of potential in this space, and we're not really looking at any consolidation right now.
Okay. But it might be a possibility down the road.
I won't rule anything out, but I don't think it's on the cards right now.
Okay. Fair enough. Cool. Well, hey, Alan, thanks so much for your time. Wish you and OFO the best of luck. And I must say, on behalf of myself, my team, we ride OFO, Mobike, other ride sharing. Well, actually, no, just OFO and Mobike. Extremely valuable service. So thanks so much for all of your efforts.
Thank you for your time, Adam.
No
And thank you
worries.
for having me.
Okay. Thanks. Cheers.
See ya.